The bus stop was 150 feet from her front door. That is the detail that never stops being difficult to sit with. Not the ransom that was never asked for. Not the years that followed. Just the distance, 150 feet, a walk her stepfather had watched her make dozens of times before, close enough that he could see her the entire way. And on the morning of June 10, 1991, he watched her walk that same distance one more time, and then he watched a stranger's car erase her from view in a matter of seconds. Jaycee Dugard was 11 years old. She would not see her mother again for 18 years. She would not be called by her own name again for 18 years. And the man responsible would spend nearly 2 decades living 40 miles from where she was taken, walking free, checking in with the very system that was supposed to be watching him. This is the story of how a girl vanished in broad daylight from a street in South Lake Tahoe, how an entire investigation went cold for almost 2 decades, and how the truth finally came out, not through a break in the case, not through new evidence, but because 2 strangers on a college campus noticed something in the way 2 little girls were behaving, and decided to ask a question. Before we get into this one, let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe, because what happened to Jaycee Dugard between 1991 and 2009 exposed failures in the parole system that experts are still studying today. To understand how this happened, you have to start with an ordinary morning in an ordinary town. South Lake Tahoe in 1991 was the kind of place people moved to for the mountains and the lake, not for anything resembling danger. Jaycee lived with her mother, Terry Probin, and her stepfather, Carl Probin, in a modest house on Washone Boulevard. She had a little sister who was just a toddler at the time. She liked horses. She was, by every account from people who knew her, a normal 5th grader, cheerful, a little shy with strangers, close with her family. On the morning of June 10, Carl Probin walked Jaycee partway to her school bus stop, as he did most mornings, and then let her continue the rest of the way alone while he stayed back near the driveway, watching her go. It was a routine so ordinary that neither of them thought twice about it. He had a clear line of sight down the road. That is when a gray sedan pulled up beside her. Carl watched a man reach out of the car and grab Jaycee. He saw her pulled toward the vehicle. He began running down the road toward her, screaming, but the car was already pulling away, and there was nothing close enough to stop it, no other car, no way to cut it off. He would later tell police that he saw a woman in the passenger seat. She did not move. She did not react. She simply sat there as the car pulled Jaycee inside and drove off. Within minutes, Carl Probin had called 911. Within the hour, El Dorado County Sheriff's deputies were combing the road for any trace of the car. A community that had never dealt with anything like this began searching immediately. Friends, neighbors, off-duty officers, dogs brought in from neighboring counties. They found almost nothing. A tan hair clip near the road. Skid marks that may or may not have meant anything. A partial description of the car, a gray sedan, possibly a Ford, and only fragments of a description of the man who took her. No plate number. No name. No direction of travel that led anywhere solid. Within days, the case had become national news. Jaycee's face appeared on flyers, in newspapers, eventually on America's Most Wanted, which would go on to feature the case multiple times over the following years. A reward fund grew. Composite sketches were circulated and revised as new partial memories surfaced from witnesses who had seen the car pass through town that morning. Carl Probin, in the aftermath, became a visible and vocal presence in the search, appearing on television, pushing the case to stay in the public eye, determined not to let his stepdaughter become another closed file. But weeks became months. Months became years. Investigators followed leads that dissolved into nothing. Psychics called in with visions that led nowhere. Sightings were reported across the western United States and quietly ruled out one by one. The reward climbed past $100,000. Still, nothing solid. By the mid-1990s, the case remained open but had gone cold in every practical sense. Investigators had, over the years, followed hundreds of tips that led nowhere, reports of girls matching her description spotted at truck stops, at fairs, in other states entirely. Each one was checked. Each one closed. The composite sketch of the abductor was revised more than once as memories shifted and new witnesses came forward years later, but no version of it ever matched a name investigators could attach to a real suspect. The FBI remained involved. The reward fund kept growing through donations. And still, nothing solid ever surfaced. Terry Probyn never stopped believing her daughter was alive. She would say, years later, that she simply knew, a conviction with no evidence behind it, the kind of certainty that grief sometimes produces and sometimes betrays. She kept Jaycee's room largely as it had been. She gave interviews on the anniversary of the abduction, year after year, refusing to let the case fade from public memory the way so many unsolved disappearances eventually do. In Jaycee's case, that instinct turned out to be correct. But for 18 years, there was no way for anyone, not her mother, not the investigators, not the reporters who occasionally revisited the story on slow news days, to know that. What almost no one searching for Jaycee knew was that she had not been taken far at all. She was less than 100 miles away, across the state line in Anch, California, in the backyard of a small house on a quiet residential street, hidden behind a fence and a maze of tents, sheds, and outbuildings that had been built specifically to conceal her. The man who took her was Philip Garrido. Garrido was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. In 1976, he had kidnapped a young woman named Katie Calloway Hall in South Lake Tahoe, the same town where he would later take Jaycee, driving her to a storage unit in Reno where he sexually assaulted her. He was caught, convicted in federal court, and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He served less than 11 of them before being granted parole in 1988. Nancy Garrido, his wife, had known him since before his conviction and had, according to later accounts, visited and corresponded with him throughout his imprisonment. After his release, they lived together in Anch, in a house that belonged to Philip Garrido's mother. On the morning of June 10, 1991, it was Nancy who sat in the passenger seat of that gray sedan while her husband pulled an 11-year-old girl off the side of the road in South Lake Tahoe, the same town, again, where his first known attack had taken place. For the next 18 years, Jaycee was kept largely confined to the backyard of that property. Garrido had constructed a concealed structure of sheds and soundproofed enclosures, tucked behind fencing and tarps so that neighbors, and critically, the parole officers assigned to monitor him, could not see what was back there. Out of respect for what Jaycee endured during those years, this story is not going to dwell on the specifics of her captivity. What matters for understanding how this happened is not the details of the abuse but the scale of the systemic failure that allowed it to continue, unnoticed, for 18 years, for miles from a school and a few blocks from neighbors who had no idea. And the failure was significant. As a registered sex offender on parole for a violent kidnapping and sexual assault conviction, Garrido was subject to regular check-ins and home inspections. Records later showed that parole agents visited his property repeatedly over the years, and on more than one occasion, information reached them that should have raised serious alarm. Neighbors had, at points, reported unusual activity on the property, including a call in the mid-1990s from a neighbor who told police she'd seen a group of tents and possibly children in the backyard. That report did not lead to a search of the property. Parole officers inspecting the home for compliance checks reportedly never went into the backyard structures where Jaycee and, eventually, her two young daughters were being kept. Garrido, meanwhile, developed increasingly erratic public behavior in the years that followed, at one point telling people he had invented a device that allowed him to communicate with God, and involving himself in various fringe religious activities around the Bay Area. He printed pamphlets, recorded videos of himself preaching, and would occasionally set up tables in public spaces to hand out religious literature to strangers. He was, by multiple accounts, known locally as strange, eccentric, someone neighbors mostly avoided rather than someone they suspected of anything specific. That is an important distinction, because it means the people around him were, in a sense, picking up on something being wrong. They simply had no framework for imagining what it actually was. A misjudgment, repeated by dozens of people over nearly 2 decades, that would prove to have enormous consequences. It is worth pausing on how many separate points of contact there were with this case over those 18 years, and how many of them failed to connect. A parole system that inspected the property without ever fully accounting for what was behind the fence. A neighbor's phone call in the 1990s that described tents and the sound of children in a yard belonging to a registered sex offender, a call that did not trigger a deeper look. Local residents who noticed the comings and goings at the house but had no reason to connect it to a kidnapping that had happened, as far as most of them knew, in a different part of the state years earlier. Each piece, taken alone, might have seemed insignificant. Together, they described almost exactly what was happening. No one ever put them together, because no single person ever had all of them in front of them at once. The break in the case, when it finally came in August of 2009, did not come from a tip, a confession, or new forensic evidence. It came from two campus police officers at UC Berkeley who noticed something was wrong. On August 24, 2009, Garrido brought two young girls with him to a table he had set up on the UC Berkeley campus, distributing religious pamphlets as part of an organization he called God's Desire. Officers Lisa Campbell and Ally Jacobs, working campus security, observed Garrido and the two girls and found their behavior unusual enough to approach. The girls' demeanor struck the officers as rehearsed, oddly formal, disconnected from what they would expect from two ordinary children accompanying their father. Something did not sit right. The officers brought the encounter to the attention of Garrido's parole agent the following day. When questioned about the girls, Garrido claimed they were his daughters, but the story he gave did not add up cleanly with what officers already knew about his background as a registered sex offender under state supervision. Digging into his file, and eventually speaking with him directly, investigators grew suspicious enough to summon him for a formal meeting at the parole office on August 26, 2009. This time, Garrido brought Jaycee with him. At the parole office, investigators separated Jaycee from Garrido and began questioning her on her own. 4 years, she had lived under an assumed name given to her by her captors, cut off from any contact with the outside world, raised inside a reality entirely constructed by the people holding her. In that small room, slowly, carefully, she began to tell the truth. She gave her real name. She told them she had been taken from South Lake Tahoe in 1991. She told them how long it had been. Jaycee Dugard was found alive at 29 years old, 18 years and 2 months after she had been pulled off the side of a road on her way to a school bus. She had given birth to 2 daughters during her captivity, both fathered by Garrido, both raised largely isolated from the outside world alongside her. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested within days. In April 2011, facing overwhelming evidence, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and multiple counts of rape and was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and was sentenced to 36 years to life for her role in the abduction and subsequent captivity. The case triggered an immediate and public reckoning with California's parole system. An independent review commissioned by the state, examining how Garrido had gone unchecked for so long despite repeated red flags, concluded that state parole agents had committed significant errors and missed opportunities over the years that could have led to Jaycee's earlier discovery. The review found that agents had, at various points, failed to conduct the kind of thorough search of the property that Garrido's status as a high-risk sex offender should have required, and that the 1990s neighbors' report describing tents and children in the yard had never been meaningfully followed up on by the agency responsible for supervising him. California's governor at the time called the findings a systemic failure, and several parole officials involved in the case faced disciplinary action, though critics at the time argued that individual firings did little to address the deeper structural gaps that had allowed the failure to persist for so long. Changes to parole oversight procedures followed in the years after, including stricter protocols for searching the full property of high-risk offenders rather than just the main residence, though the case remains, for many advocates, a defining example of how monitoring systems can fail even when the warning signs are documented and on file, sitting in a folder that no one connects to the others. For Jaycee, the return to the world after 18 years came with an adjustment that most people can barely imagine. She had missed her entire adolescence. She had never had an ordinary friendship, an ordinary school day, an ordinary conversation with someone her own age who wasn't also confined to that backyard. Her mother, Terry, who had held on to the belief that her daughter was alive through nearly 2 decades with no evidence to support it, was reunited with her in the days following the arrest, a reunion captured in photographs that circulated around the world, 2 women meeting again as near strangers who had once been simply mother and daughter. In the immediate aftermath, Jaycee and her 2 daughters had to be introduced, essentially from scratch, to a world that had moved on entirely without them. Technology had changed. Culture had changed. Ordinary systems that most people take for granted, school enrollment, medical records, even basic social interaction with people their own age, had to be built from a starting point of almost nothing. Jaycee has said in interviews that some of the hardest early moments were not dramatic at all. They were small. Learning to order food in a restaurant. Learning to use a cell phone. Understanding that 18 years had passed in a world that kept moving the entire time she was cut off from it. In the years that followed, Jaycee chose, deliberately and publicly, to reclaim her own story rather than let it remain something that had only happened to her. In 2011, she published a memoir titled A Stolen Life, writing in her own words about the abduction and the process of returning to a world that had moved on without her. The book became a bestseller and gave her, for the first time, control over how her own story was told, after nearly 2 decades of being spoken about by other people, investigators, reporters, even her captors, instead of speaking for herself. She founded the Jaycee Foundation. The name stands for Just Ask Yourself to Care, to support other survivors of abduction and their families as they navigate the return to ordinary life, something Jaycee has said she wished someone had been equipped to help her with in the earliest days after her rescue. The foundation has since worked with other survivors of long-term captivity, offering the kind of practical and emotional support that Jaycee had to figure out for herself, largely without guidance, in the months after 2009. She has since spoken publicly about the specific and often overlooked challenges of reintegration, rebuilding an identity, learning to trust institutions again, and helping her own daughters adjust to a world they were never allowed to know, one that did not come with an instruction manual for either of them. She has also become one of the most persistent public voices calling for reform of parole supervision standards, testifying and speaking about the specific failures in her own case not to relive them, but because she has said plainly that the same gaps that let Garrido keep her hidden for 18 years could just as easily let another case slip through today if nothing changes. There are a few things about this case that are worth sitting with once the facts are laid out. The first is how close the truth was for so long. Jaycee was not taken across the country. She was not moved between states or hidden in some remote, inaccessible place. She spent 18 years less than 100 miles from where she was abducted, in a residential neighborhood, behind a fence, visited periodically by the exact state employees whose job was to check on the man keeping her there. The failure in this case was not a lack of information. Neighbors called. Officers visited. The information existed. It simply was not acted on with the seriousness it demanded, again and again, for 18 years. The second is what this case says about how children can disappear even in places that feel safe. South Lake Tahoe was not a dangerous city. Jaycee's walk to the bus stop was not a risky one. It was the kind of short, familiar walk that happens in front of thousands of houses every single morning across the country. What happened to her did not require a lapse in her family's judgment. It required a stranger willing to act in the handful of seconds when a quiet street was, for once, unwatched. And the third is something Jaycee herself has spoken about directly: the difference between being rescued and being recovered. Her physical rescue took a matter of minutes once the truth came out in that parole office in August 2009. Her recovery, of an identity, a childhood she was never allowed to finish, a relationship with a mother who had spent 18 years grieving a daughter she refused to bury in her own mind, is something she has said, in her own words, never fully ends. It simply becomes something you carry forward instead of something that stops you. It is also worth remembering that the two officers who noticed something was wrong outside that Barclay building were not investigating a kidnapping. They were not looking for Jaycee Dugard specifically, and they had no reason to connect Garrido to a case from 1991. They simply paid attention to something that felt slightly off in the way two children were behaving next to a man handing out pamphlets, and they followed that instinct one step further than most people would have. 18 years of searching, tip lines, sketches, and reward money did not break this case open. Two campus police officers choosing to ask one more question did. There is also the matter of Carl Probyn, Jaycee's stepfather, who spent years as the public face of the search, appearing on television broadcasts and true crime specials pushing law enforcement to keep the case active. He never got to see the moment his stepdaughter was found. He had passed away in 2004, 5 years before Garrido's arrest, having spent the last years of his life still not knowing what had happened to the girl he had watched disappear from 150 feet away. It is a detail that rarely makes the highlight reel of this case, but it belongs in it. Not everyone who spent years fighting for the truth lived to see it arrive. Jaycee Dugard's case did not end the way most cases like it end. It did not end in a discovery years too late, in a body, in a closed file with no answers. It ended with a woman walking back into a room with her mother, 29 years old, having survived 18 years that the system around her had, for far too long, failed to notice. If this story stayed with you, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and share it, because the reason cases like this matter isn't just what happened to Jaycee Dugard. It's what her case forced the system to confront, and what still has to be watched for, so the next child taken off a quiet street doesn't wait 18 years for someone to finally ask the right question.